Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm a lab assistant at a facility beneath the Arctic ice. The dark web claims we're guarding an ancient alien being. Yesterday, it woke up. Hey Reddit, throwaway account here for reasons that will make sense soon. I'm not really sure how to even begin this, but if you've ever scrolled through Asachi conspiracy or stumbled into some of the weirder corners of the dark web, you might have read about Project Enoch. Some call it a hoax. Others think it's a massive government cover-up. Supposedly, it's a top-secret facility buried beneath the Arctic ice, designed to study something ancient, something not from here. Well, I work there. Or, I did. And yesterday, something happened that I can't explain, and I'm terrified I'll be silenced for even typing this. Let me back up. About 3 years ago, I was in a bad spot. I just graduated with a degree in molecular biology, but the job market sucked, and student loans were crushing me. I was picking up shifts at a coffee shop and crashing in my friend's spare room when I got this email. It was from a company I'd never heard of, Apex Biosystems, saying they'd seen my thesis work and wanted to offer me an interview for a unique research opportunity. The email was vague, almost too vague, but they were offering 6 figures, relocation expenses, and the kind of benefits package you only see in movies. I didn't think twice. The interview was weird. It wasn't at their headquarters. It was in this dingy, rented office in Chicago. The guy interviewing me was wearing a plain black suit with no tie, and he didn't even introduce himself. No small talk. No, tell me about your experience. Just a series of rapid-fire questions. How comfortable are you with isolation? Can you follow orders without question? Do you believe in extraterrestrial life? I laughed at the last one, thinking it was a joke, but the guy didn't even blink. I should have seen the red flags, but desperate times, right? 2 weeks later, I was on a private flight to northern Canada, then transferred to a helicopter, then finally escorted into a facility so deep beneath the ice that my ears popped every time we descended. The facility. The place was massive. Picture something out of a Bond villain's lair. High-tech labs, endless hallways, and security everywhere. We weren't even allowed to know how many floors there were. My clearance was for level 4, which, as far as I knew, was the second highest. Only a handful of people had access to level 5, and they never talked about it. If you asked too many questions, you'd get reassigned. Or worse, my job wasn't anything too crazy, at least at first. I analyzed tissue samples, ran experiments, logged data. Typical lab stuff, except the samples were strange. Some looked like organic material, but the cell structure didn't match anything on Earth. Others weren't even biological. Crystalline structures that emitted low-level radiation or pulsated faintly under certain light frequencies. When I asked where they came from, my supervisor, Dr. Cole, would just say, "Focus on the work, Parker." And then there was the artifact. It wasn't called that officially. Its designation was Object 411, but everyone just called it the artifact. It was housed in the center of the facility, in this reinforced chamber surrounded by enough security to make Fort Knox look like a convenience store. I only saw it once, during orientation, when they marched us past it like a tour group. It was massive, at least 15 feet tall, jet black, and shaped like an elongated egg. The surface was smooth, but had these faint geometric patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. It was the only thing on level 5 that we were ever allowed to glimpse, and even then, only from behind a thick layer of glass. One of the guards told me in passing that the artifact had been here for decades, maybe longer. Some said it wasn't even human-made. The rumors, working in a place like this, you can't help but hear things. Some of it was probably just paranoia. Working underground for months on end does that to people. But other stories stuck with me. People said the artifact wasn't just sitting there. It was alive. Not in the way we think of life, but aware. There were stories about researchers who spent too much time near it, hearing whispers or seeing things that weren't there. One guy supposedly had a complete psychotic break and had to be evacuated. Then there were the guards. These weren't your average rent-a-cops. They were ex-military, always armed, always on edge. A few months ago, one of them slipped up and told me about an incident on level 5. Apparently, someone tried to open the artifact. No one knows what happened, but half the staff was reassigned, and we were all banned from even mentioning the event. And then there were the dark web rumors. I didn't believe them at first, but one of the junior researchers, Emma, showed me a screenshot on her phone. It was from some deep web forum, talking about a secret Arctic facility where the government was hiding an alien god they'd found in the ice. The post claimed the artifact was some kind of stasis pod, and whatever was inside wasn't dead. It was just waiting. We laughed it off at the time, but now I'm not so sure. Yesterday it started like any other day. I was working late in the lab, analyzing a new batch of samples, when the power flickered. Not a big deal. It happened sometimes during storms. But then the emergency lights came on, and the alarm started blaring. At first, I thought it was a drill. But then the intercom crackled, and Dr. Cole's voice came through, sounding panicked. All level 4 personnel, evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my coat and headed for the elevators. But when I got there, the doors wouldn't open. A security guard, one of the serious ones, appeared out of nowhere, shouting at us to head to the emergency stairwell. I could hear shouting and the distant hum of machinery coming from somewhere above us. That's when I noticed Emma. She was standing in the corner, staring at her phone, her face pale. I asked her what was wrong, and she just turned the screen toward me. It was another screenshot from the same dark web forum. The post was only a few minutes old, but it already had dozens of replies. Breaking. Something's happening at Project Enoch. Artifact breach confirmed. It's awake. The stairwell was chaos. Alarms were still screaming. Red emergency lights flickered erratically, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. People were pushing and shoving, all of us desperate to get out, but no one seemed to know what was happening. I kept close to Emma, trying to stay calm. She kept looking at her phone, refreshing that damn forum post, like it held all the answers. What does that even mean, it's awake? I asked her, barely keeping the panic out of my voice. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the screen. Finally, she muttered, almost to herself. They knew this would happen. They'd been talking about it for months. People on these forums, they'd been warning about the artifact waking up. It felt like my stomach dropped into my feet. I wanted to tell her she was crazy, that she was just spooked by internet nonsense, but something about the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't scared. She was terrified. We made it down a few flights of stairs before we hit a bottleneck. A cluster of people had stopped, shouting and arguing. At first, I couldn't tell what was going on, but then I saw why they weren't moving. 2 guards were blocking the door to level 3. They were fully kitted out, helmets, body armor, assault rifles, and they looked shaken. One of them kept shouting, "This area is sealed. Return to level 4. His voice cracked on the last word, which didn't exactly inspire confidence. Someone in the crowd yelled back, "What the hell are we supposed to do?" "We can't go back." More voices joined in, the panic spreading like wildfire. I could feel the tension rising, the kind that could snap into violence at any second. And then we heard it. A deep, resonant thrum echoed through the stairwell, like the hum of a massive engine coming to life. It wasn't loud, but it was so low-pitched that I felt it in my chest, like a second heartbeat. Everyone froze. For a moment, the only sound was the alarms, still blaring overhead. Then came the scream. It was high-pitched, ragged, and it sounded like it was coming from far below us. But the way it echoed, it felt like it was everywhere at once. I couldn't tell if it was human or not, but whatever it wasn't natural. It was the kind of sound that makes your brain scream run before you even know what you're running from. The guards bolted. No warnings, no orders. They just turned and ran up the stairs. That was all it took. The crowd erupted into full-blown panic. People shoved past each other, climbing over the railing, anything to get away. Emma grabbed my arm, and we started moving, but the stairwell was so packed that we could barely make any progress. The thrum came again, louder this time, and the floor beneath us vibrated. That's when the lights cut out completely. No emergency lights, no flashlights, just pitch black darkness. I don't know if you've ever been in total darkness before, but it does something to your mind. You start imagining things, seeing shapes that aren't there, hearing whispers in the silence. Except I wasn't imagining it. The shadows. I don't know how to explain what I saw, or if I even really saw it, but in the darkness, there was movement. Not people, not shadows cast by the flickering lights. Something else. It was like the air itself was shifting, twisting into shapes that were almost, but not quite human. I caught glimpses of them in the dim red light from the alarm strobes. Tall, spindly figures that seemed to shimmer in and out of existence. Emma must have seen them too, because she squeezed my arm so hard it hurt. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Just keep moving." I tried to focus on the stairs beneath my feet, counting each step, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But the sounds. God, the sounds. The stairwell wasn't silent anymore. I could hear something above us, like wet footsteps slapping against concrete, and something below us. A deep, guttural clicking noise that made my skin crawl. We finally made it to another landing, where a small group had gathered, huddled in the corner like frightened animals. Someone was trying to get a flashlight to work, but the beam kept flickering, casting jagged shadows on the walls. One of the guards, the same one who'd blocked the door earlier, was sitting against the wall, holding his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him alive. "What the hell is going on?" someone demanded, their voice high and panicked. The guard looked up, his eyes wide and glassy. "It's breached containment," he muttered. "Level 5 is gone. It's everywhere." "What's everywhere?" I asked. But he didn't answer. Instead, he started mumbling to himself, something about patterns and the voice. He kept looking past us, into the darkness, like he could see something we couldn't. Before anyone could press him further, the thrum came again, so loud this time that the walls seemed to ripple. The guard's mumbling turned into a scream, and then he just stopped. His body went rigid, and his head snapped back against the wall with a sickening crack. His mouth was wide open, like he was still screaming, but no sound came out. And then he started to bleed, not from his eyes or his nose, but from everywhere. His skin split open, thin red lines tracing across his body in geometric patterns that looked eerily familiar, like the ones on the artifact. The blood didn't drip. It floated, hovering in the air like tiny crimson orbs before dissipating into nothing. Someone screamed, and the flashlight beam jerked wildly, illuminating the stairwell. For a split second, I saw something above us, something impossible. It was massive, its shape constantly shifting, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Dozens of glowing white-hot eyes blinked in and out of existence, and its body was covered in those same geometric patterns, pulsing faintly in the dark. Then the light went out again, and the thing was gone. The escape. We didn't wait around after that. Emma and I pushed through the crowd, forcing our way up the stairs. At some point, I lost track of the others. Maybe they went back down, maybe they didn't. All I knew was that we had to get out, and we had to get out now. The stairwell seemed to go on forever. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. Behind us, the clicking noises were getting louder, closer, and I swear I could feel something brushing against my back, cold and wet and wrong. Finally, we reached the top. The doors to the surface were open, and a blast of icy air hit me like a slap to the face. There were vehicles waiting, a few snowmobiles, a helicopter with its rotors already spinning. A guard was waving people aboard, shouting, "Move! Move! Move!" Emma and I barely made it to the chopper before it lifted off. As we ascended, I looked down and saw the facility for the first time from the outside. The ice around it was cracking, huge fissures spreading out in every direction, and in the center, where the artifact chamber should have been, there was a massive, glowing crater. Something was moving in it, something big, and then the radio crackled, and a voice came through, distorted but unmistakably calm. Containment failed. Initiating Protocol Omega. God help us all. I thought being in the helicopter meant we were safe. We weren't. As we climbed higher, I kept my eyes glued to the facility below. The fissures in the ice were widening, jagged cracks spreading out like veins. Steam, or maybe smoke, was rising from the crater where the artifact chamber had been, glowing faintly in the twilight. Whatever was down there wasn't just waking up. It was emerging. Emma sat next to me, gripping the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The other passengers, mostly guards and a few researchers I didn't recognize, were all silent, their faces pale and drawn. Nobody knew what to say. And honestly, what could you say? We just left behind something that shouldn't exist, something that felt wrong in a way that went beyond fear. The pilot's voice crackled over the headset. "Base Camp Bravo. This is Eagle 1. We've got evac from Level 4, requesting clearance for emergency landing." There was a pause, then a response, but it wasn't what I expected. The voice on the other end was flat, robotic, like it was pre-recorded. "Protocol Omega is in effect. No unauthorized aircraft are permitted to approach Base Camp Bravo. Return to your assigned vector immediately. The pilot's knuckles tightened on the controls. Bravo! This is an emergency evac. We've got civilians on board. Return to your assigned vector, the voice repeated. Then, after a brief pause, deviation will result in immediate countermeasures. What the hell does that mean? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rotors. The pilot didn't respond. He just swore under his breath and veered the helicopter east, away from the base. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the distant crackle of the radio. And then the lights went out. The blackout, the helicopter plunged into darkness, the cabin lights and instrument panels flickering before shutting off completely. The hum of the engine sputtered and died, and for a terrifying moment, we were free falling, weightless in the Arctic night. Someone screamed. I couldn't tell who. It might have been me. Just as suddenly, the power came back on. The engine roared to life, and the helicopter jerked violently as the pilot regained control. But something was wrong. The instruments were going haywire, the altimeter spinning in circles, and the GPS screen was filled with static. The radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't a voice. It was a sound, a deep, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat, overlaid with faint whispers. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were inside my head, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Do you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. I nodded. What is it? She didn't answer. I don't think she could. Suddenly, the helicopter lurched to the side. The pilot shouted something I couldn't make out, and the aircraft tilted sharply, throwing us against our harnesses. I caught a glimpse out the window and saw something moving in the darkness. Something massive. It wasn't solid, at least not in the way we think of solid. It was a shifting, amorphous shape, blotting out the stars as it twisted and writhed. Its edges shimmered like heat haze, and every so often I caught glimpses of those glowing geometric patterns, faint but unmistakable. It was following us, the crash. The helicopter couldn't outrun it. The pilot tried. God, he tried, but the thing was faster, and the whispers were getting louder, drowning out everything else. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, oppressive, like we were being crushed from all sides. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else. Not the Arctic, not the helicopter, but a vast, endless expanse filled with towering shapes and swirling light. And then we hit the ground. The impact was violent. The helicopter skidded across the ice, the rotors shearing off and tearing through the cabin. I don't remember much after that, just a deafening roar, the taste of blood in my mouth and the feeling of cold biting into my skin like needles. When I came to, the world was eerily quiet. The helicopter was on its side. One of the doors ripped clean off. Snow and ice had blown into the cabin, covering everything in a thin, glittering layer. I tried to move, but every muscle in my body screamed in protest. My head was pounding, and my vision was blurry, but I was alive. Emma, I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. I forced myself to sit up, biting back a groan. The cabin was a wreck, seats torn loose, equipment scattered everywhere. Two of the guards were slumped against the walls, motionless. Emma was nowhere to be seen. I stumbled out of the wreckage, my boots crunching on the ice. The wind had picked up, howling across the frozen tundra. But the thing that had followed us was gone. Or maybe it wasn't. I couldn't tell anymore. The base. In the distance, I saw lights, bright, unnatural, cutting through the storm. They weren't from the base. They were too far east. But they were the only sign of life. So I started walking. The cold was brutal, seeping into my bones with every step. My breath came in ragged gasps, forming plumes of white that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. I kept telling myself I just had to keep moving, one step at a time, but with every step, the whispers came back. They weren't loud, not yet, but they were there, faint and insistent, threading through the wind like a half-remembered dream. And they weren't random. They were speaking to me, calling my name. Parker. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was clearer now, louder. It wasn't just in my head. It was coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, slowly, and saw something standing on the ice. It wasn't human. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body shimmering like a mirage. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was featureless, save for a single glowing symbol where its eyes should have been, the same symbol that had been on the artifact. Parker, it said again, its voice low and resonant, vibrating in my skull. You have seen, you have heard, you cannot return. I tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like invisible hands were choking the words out of me. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed toward the lights in the distance. Run! And then it was gone. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My boots pounded against the ice, slipping and crunching as I barreled toward the lights in the distance. The wind screamed in my ears, and the cold bit into my skin, but none of it mattered. All I could think about was the figure, the impossible thing that had spoken to me. Its voice echoed in my head, resonating with something deep and primal, something that made my instincts scream, "Get away." The lights weren't getting any closer. At first, I thought it was just my exhaustion. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burned, and every breath was a struggle against the freezing air. But no matter how far I ran, the lights stayed the same distance away, flickering faintly through the storm. It was like they were teasing me, leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. And then I heard it again, the thrum. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, so close that I could feel the vibrations in my chest. The ice beneath me cracked, sending thin, jagged lines snaking outward in every direction. I slowed to a stop, my heart pounding in my ears, and turned around. There was nothing there, just endless white, stretching into the darkness. But the thrum came again, louder now, accompanied by a low, rhythmic, clicking sound. It was the same sound I'd heard in the stairwell, and it sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I backed away, my eyes scanning the storm for any sign of movement, but the wind made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then the lights went out, not the ones in the distance, all of them. The faint glow from the helicopter wreckage, the stars overhead, even the pale blue of the ice itself. It all vanished in an instant, leaving me in absolute darkness. I froze, panic clawing at my throat. The only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the faint crunch of snow as I shifted my weight. And then, just behind me, a voice whispered, "Parker!" I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was nothing there, nothing I could see anyway. But the voice was close, so close I could feel its breath against the back of my neck. "Do you understand yet?" it asked. "Do you see?" The rift, the darkness didn't last. Slowly the lights came back, but they weren't the same. They weren't soft or natural. They were harsh, pulsating beams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, casting jagged shadows across the ice. I wasn't alone anymore. Shapes moved in the distance, silhouetted against the flickering light. They were tall and thin, their bodies elongated and distorted, like shadows stretched out of proportion. They didn't walk, they glided, their movements smooth and unnatural, like they were being pulled along by invisible strings. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the flare gun I'd taken from the wreckage. My fingers fumbled for the trigger, and I fired into the air, the bright red arc of light illuminating the landscape for a brief, terrible moment. That's when I saw it. The crater, where the artifact chamber had been, wasn't just a hole in the ice. It was a rift, a jagged tear in reality itself. The edges shimmered and twisted, impossible angles folding into one another like some kind of warped kaleidoscope. And inside the rift, something was moving. It was massive, too big to comprehend, its form constantly shifting and reshaping itself. One moment, it looked like a tangle of limbs and eyes, each glowing with a cold, white light. The next, it was a formless mass of shadows, writhing and twisting as if in pain, and all around it, the air shimmered with those same geometric patterns, glowing faintly in the dark. The thing wasn't just alive, it was aware. It saw me. The whispering started again, louder this time, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. But buried beneath the gibberish, I could hear something familiar. My name, over and over again, spoken in 100 different tones and cadences. Parker, Parker, Parker. I turned and ran. The facility that shouldn't exist. The lights I'd been chasing weren't a mirage. They belonged to a building, low and rectangular, half buried in the ice. It didn't look like part of the main facility. It was smaller, older, like something from a Cold War-era military base. The walls were weathered and rust-streaked, and the windows were covered with heavy metal shutters. A faded sign above the door read, Apex Biosystems, Outpost Theta. I didn't care what it was or why it was there. I just wanted to be inside. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar, and I shoved it open with all my strength. The inside was even more dilapidated than the outside. Cracked linoleum floors, flickering fluorescent lights, and a thick layer of frost coating every surface. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but it wasn't empty. The first thing I saw was blood. It was smeared across the walls and floor, frozen in jagged streaks. There were bodies too, at least 3, though it was hard to tell with how mangled they were. Their uniforms marked them as guards, but their weapons were gone, and their faces, God, their faces. It was like something had carved into them, etching those same geometric patterns into their skin. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping over the bodies as I made my way deeper into the outpost. The whispers were still there, growing louder with every step, but now they were accompanied by something else, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from the very walls. At the end of the hallway, I found the source, the machine. The room was dominated by a massive machine, its structure stretching from floor to ceiling. It was covered in blinking lights and panels, but the design was completely alien, organic almost. Tubes and wires snaked out from the walls, pulsating faintly as if they were alive. In the center of the machine was a console, its surface glowing with the same shifting geometric patterns I'd seen on the artifact. Emma was standing in front of it. At first, I thought she was dead. She wasn't moving, and her skin was pale and frostbitten, but then her head jerked up, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, glowing faintly with the same cold, white light as the rift. "Emma?" I whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed at the console. The patterns on its surface shifted, rearranging themselves into something I almost recognized. Words, a single phrase, repeated over and over again. "Open the gate." I stumbled back, my mind racing. The whispers were deafening now, the voices overlapping and crashing into one another like waves. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I knew was that I had to stop whatever was happening. I grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the console with all my strength. The glass shattered, sparks flying as the machine let out a high-pitched screech. Emma screamed too, a raw, inhuman sound that made my blood run cold, and then the lights went out again. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It was absolute. It felt alive, pressing against my skin, seeping into my lungs. For a moment, I thought I'd gone blind, until I realized the glow from the shattered console was still faintly visible, casting an eerie, shifting light across the room. Emma was gone. I spun around, my chest heaving, but the room was empty. The only sounds were the hum of the machine, still faintly operational despite the damage I'd done, and the whispers, endless, overlapping, growing louder with each passing second. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the room, vibrating in the air, reverberating off the walls. And then, in the corner of my vision, something moved. It was one of the shadows. No, not just one. There were many of them, emerging from the walls, their forms flickering and distorting like static on an old TV. They weren't solid, but they weren't illusions either. They pulsed with a cold inner light, their elongated limbs twisting and bending in ways that made my stomach churn. I backed away, clutching the broken chair leg like it was some kind of weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. The shadows didn't attack. They just stood there, watching, their eyeless faces fixed on me. And then one of them spoke. "You cannot stop it." The voice was a low, guttural hiss, layered with dozens of other voices, all speaking in unison. It sounded amused. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my mind spinning. The words wouldn't come. "You broke the shell," the shadow continued, its form rippling as it moved closer. "But the gate is open." I glanced back at the machine. The patterns on the console were still shifting, faster now, the glowing symbols rearranging themselves into something new. The hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating the floor beneath my feet. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew one thing. Whatever the machine was doing, it wasn't finished. I turned to run, but the doorway was gone. The shadows had closed in, their forms stretching and twisting to block every exit. I was trapped. And then the room changed. The other side. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle at first. A flicker in the air, a strange sensation of weightlessness. The walls around me seemed to bend and warp, the rusted metal rippling like water. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just sounds anymore. They were thoughts, alien, intrusive thoughts pressing into my mind, filling it with images I couldn't understand. The rift was here. It unfolded in the center of the room like a massive, jagged wound, the edges shimmering with impossible colors. Through it, I could see things, massive, incomprehensible shapes, twisting and writhing in the void, their forms too vast and chaotic to fully comprehend. They were beautiful and horrifying, all at once, their glowing eyes fixed on me, with an intensity that made me feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. One of the shadows stepped forward, its elongated form silhouetted against the rift. "Do you understand now, Parker?" it asked, its voice reverberating through my skull. "You were never meant to leave." I shook my head, stumbling backward. What is this? What are you?" "We are the gatekeepers," the shadow replied. "But the gate is no longer ours to keep. You have unleashed it. The ancient will return." The whispers reached a crescendo, and the rift flared brighter, the patterns on its surface shifting and twisting into something almost recognizable, like letters, but not quite. My mind strained to make sense of it, but the harder I tried, the more my head throbbed. And then I saw her. Emma stepped through the rift, her body surrounded by the same shimmering light as the shadows. Her face was blank, expressionless, but her eyes burned with a cold, unnatural light. She didn't speak, but I could feel her thoughts pressing into mine. "You broke it," her voice said, not aloud, but in my head. "The gate cannot be closed." The rift began to widen, tearing through the room like a gaping maw. The walls of the outpost dissolved into nothingness, leaving me standing on the edge of a vast, endless void. The ground beneath my feet cracked and crumbled, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to." "Intent is irrelevant," the shadow said, its voice cold and final. "The ancient will rise. The balance will be restored." The collapse. The last thing I remember was the ground giving way beneath me. I fell, tumbling through the void, the shadows and the rift, and the impossible shapes all swirling around me. The whispers grew louder until they were a deafening roar, and then silence. I woke up in the snow. The outpost was gone. The rift was gone. The only sign that any of it had ever been real was the faint glow on the horizon where the facility had been. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the stars, my mind blank and my body frozen. Eventually I got up and started walking. I don't know how I survived. I don't know how I made it back to civilization. All I know is that I did. But it's not over. The aftermath, the whispers haven't stopped. They're quieter now, but they're always there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. I see the patterns everywhere, in the cracks in the pavement, in the way the light filters through the trees, in the static on my TV. I dream about the rift almost every night, and when I wake up, I swear I can still feel the cold. I've tried to warn people, but nobody listens. I've posted online, contacted reporters, even tried reaching out to former coworkers, but it's like the world has moved on. The facility is gone, erased from existence, and Apex Biosystems denies ever employing me. It's like they want everyone to forget, but I can't forget, and neither will you, because I know what I saw. I know what's coming. The ancient isn't just waking up. It's already here. It's in the cracks, the whispers, the patterns we can't see. It's everywhere, and it's only a matter of time. I'm a photographer exploring abandoned military bases. A dark web map marked a base in Alaska as forbidden. Yesterday, I found a sealed room full of strange claw marks. I've always been the kind of guy who loves to explore the forgotten. There's something about old, abandoned places that feels haunting in the best way possible. Maybe it's the history, maybe it's the quiet, or maybe it's just the weird thrill of being somewhere you're not supposed to be. I take photos for a living, mostly urban exploration stuff, and my Instagram's grown a decent following because of it. But this story isn't about Instagram or my usual urbex spots. It's about a place I should have never gone to. It all started a couple of weeks ago when I was digging around on the internet for potential locations. Normally, I stick to forums and word-of-mouth recommendations from other explorers. But that day, I got curious. I'd heard whispers about maps on the dark web, guides to places too dangerous, secret, or illegal to be on any normal map. It sounded sketchy as hell, but I figured, why not? Worst case, it's just a dead end. I won't go into the details of how I accessed the map. It's better if you don't know, but I found it. It was a crudely designed interface with hundreds of red dots scattered across a black screen. Each dot represented a site. Some were abandoned hospitals, others were mines, old prisons, or even classified government bunkers. Most had vague descriptions like hazardous or keep out. But one dot, way up in Alaska, stood out immediately. The description was just one word: forbidden. I clicked on it, half expecting the site to crash or for my laptop to burst into flames. Instead, I got a set of coordinates and a note: do not approach. Facility closed in 1984. High risk, unexplained phenomena. Below that was a grainy black and white photo of what looked like a military base covered in snow. Most of the buildings were in ruins, but one, the largest, was intact. Its windows were boarded up, and something about the image just felt wrong. Like I could almost hear it humming. It wasn't like I didn't know better. I've seen enough bad movies to know messing with the deep web is a recipe for disaster. But the thing is, this wasn't just some creepy pasta I'd stumbled across at 3 a.m. The coordinates were real, and my curiosity was already chewing at me like a dog on a bone. So I booked a flight to Anchorage, Alaska, and packed my gear. I told myself it would just be like any other shoot. A cool story for Instagram, maybe even a documentary project. I should have known better. Part 2. The base. The journey to the coordinates was brutal. After landing in Anchorage, I had to rent a 4x4 and drive for hours through snow-covered wilderness. I passed through small, dying towns where gas stations looked like relics from the 50s. Cell service vanished within the first 100 miles, leaving me alone with nothing but the crunch of tires on snow and the occasional call of a raven overhead. The last leg of the trip wasn't even a road. It was a frozen path that could barely pass for a trail, winding through endless trees until I finally spotted the base. It was exactly like the photo, a collection of broken down buildings, half buried in snow, with that one main structure looming in the center, like a predator watching its prey. Pulling up, I killed the engine and stepped out, immediately hit by an eerie silence. No wind, no rustling, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant creak of metal from one of the crumbling towers. The place reeked of decay and abandonment, but something about it didn't feel empty. I slung my camera over my shoulder and started exploring. The smaller buildings were boring: old barracks, a mess hall, and some storage sheds filled with rusted tools and snowdrifts. But the main building, that was different. The doors were chained shut, but someone had clearly been here before me. The chains were snapped, hanging loose like they'd been torn apart, not cut. My boots crunched over broken glass as I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, scanning the space. The air inside was colder than it had any right to be. My breath came out in thick clouds as I made my way through the gutted hallways. The walls were lined with peeling paint and faded signs, authorized personnel only and decontamination area. But what struck me most were the scratches. They were everywhere, long jagged claw marks running across the walls, floors, and even the ceilings. Some were shallow, like a cat had gone wild, but others were deep enough to carve into the concrete. Whatever made them had to be strong. I told myself it was just vandalism. Maybe some explorer with a crowbar trying to spook people like me. But the deeper I went into the building, the less that made sense. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, spirals, that made my head ache if I'd looked at them too long. And there was this smell, metallic and rotten, like blood left out in the sun. Part 3. The sealed room. I don't know why I kept going. I should have turned back right then and there. But something about the place felt like a challenge, like it was daring me to find whatever it was hiding. Eventually, I found a staircase leading down. The basement. It was pitch black. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I descended, every step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, I found a heavy steel door with a faded biohazard symbol painted on it. It was sealed shut, but not locked. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. My heart was pounding as I gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned open, revealing a massive, empty room. The walls were covered in more claw marks, and the floor was littered with broken glass and bones. Small ones. Animal bones, I told myself, though some looked disturbingly human. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room, there was a circular hole in the ground about 6 feet wide. A metal grate covered it, bolted down with massive screws. The claw marks around it were the deepest yet, like something had tried to escape. I took a step closer, raising my camera to snap a photo, but before I could, I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the hole. Something was down there. When I first saw the base up close, I realized pictures don't do justice to the kind of dread a place like this gives off. Everything about it screamed wrong. The snow around the perimeter looked untouched, like no one had been here in decades, but the building itself seemed alive. Not alive like it was moving, but alive in the way an old tree feels alive. A thing that's been standing so long, it's soaked up the energy of everything that's ever happened around it. You could feel it pressing on you. The windows of the main building were covered with heavy steel shutters, like they were trying to keep something in, not out. There were no official signs, no military insignias, no warnings, nothing to even indicate what branch of the government had operated here. The only marker was a faded flagpole jutting out at an awkward angle, like it had been forced down. It still had a shredded scrap of the American flag dangling from it, flapping silently in the cold breeze. The closer I got, the weirder the base felt. You ever walk into a room and immediately sense you're not alone? That's what it felt like standing outside that building, like someone or something was watching me. And it wasn't just paranoia. My body felt heavy, almost like I was wading through water instead of snow. Every step took effort. My camera bag, which I'd carried hundreds of times, felt like it weighed double. I ignored it and started with the smaller structures. Most of them were in complete ruins. The first was an old barracks. Its roof collapsed in on itself. Inside, I found rows of bunks rusting into dust, with tattered green blankets that were stiff as cardboard from the cold. The walls were covered in faded writing, lists of names, dates, and what looked like tallies carved into the paint. Whatever these guys were doing out here, they weren't happy about it. There were random drawings too, things like spirals, animal skulls, and what looked like crude maps. One showed a cluster of buildings with a giant X over the main one. That part creeped me out because it was clearly made by someone inside the base, someone who wanted to mark the building as off-limits. I kept moving. The next structure was a mess hall, or what was left of it. Long tables and benches were strewn about, most broken into pieces. There were old cans of food scattered across the floor, along with fragments of plates and silverware. In the far corner, I found an old radio, its casing smashed to pieces. When I picked it up, I realized something weird. The damage wasn't from age or weather. It was deliberate, like someone had taken a hammer to it. And next to it, in huge red letters painted on the wall, were the words, "Do not listen." It didn't make sense, but the phrase stuck with me as I worked my way through the rest of the base. None of the smaller buildings had anything worth photographing. They were all wrecked, stripped bare by time or vandals. But that main building, that was where the real story was. The front doors were massive, heavy steel things with reinforced hinges. They looked like they belonged in a prison, not a military base. One door was hanging slightly ajar, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. As soon as I stepped inside, it hit me. Silence. Not the kind of quiet you get when you're deep in the woods, where there's still the sound of wind or animals. This was dead silence, the kind that makes your ears strain to pick up anything. A hum, a creak, even your own breathing. But there was nothing. My boots crunched on the icy floor as I moved down the first hallway, the sound echoing back at me like I was walking through a cave. The layout of the building didn't make sense. The first hallway was lined with empty offices, all stripped of furniture, except for the occasional desk or chair that looked like it had been tossed into a corner. Every single room had windows that were completely blacked out, not boarded up, just dark. I waved my flashlight over one to see if I could catch a glimpse of the outside, but the glass seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. As I made my way deeper, I found something strange. A pair of boots sitting neatly in the middle of the hallway. At first, I thought they were just old army boots someone had left behind. But when I crouched down to look closer, I realized they weren't empty. They still had socks stuffed inside, and the laces were tied tight, like someone had stepped out of them in a hurry. The air was colder the further in I went. I kept having to stop and wipe frost off my camera lens. The walls were covered in scratches, but not the kind I'd seen in the other buildings. These were smaller, more precise, almost like someone had carved into the paint with a knife. They formed patterns, circles and triangles, overlapping each other in ways that hurt my head to look at. One room caught my attention because the door was closed, unlike all the others. I tried to open it, but it was locked. That didn't stop me from noticing the weird stain spreading out from underneath it. At first, I thought it was oil, but when I crouched down and sniffed it, don't judge me, it smelled metallic, like blood. I decided not to push my luck and kept moving. The deeper I went, the more wrong the building felt. The hallway started to twist and turn, making it harder to keep track of where I was. Some of the corridors were completely caved in, forcing me to double back and find alternate routes. I started to notice other things, too, little details that didn't make sense, like how my flashlight would dim slightly whenever I passed certain doorways, or how some rooms felt warmer than others, even though the whole building was freezing. Then I found the staircase. It was at the end of a hallway, lined with lockers. Most of the lockers were open and empty, but a few were still locked. I almost ignored them, but something caught my eye. One of the locker doors had the same words I'd seen in the mess hall, scrawled in white paint. "Do not listen." The paint looked fresh, like it had been done recently. I didn't have time to think about it, though, because I heard something, a faint sound coming from the staircase. It wasn't a voice, exactly. It was more like humming, low and steady, like a machine running in the distance. But there was something off about it. It didn't have a rhythm. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded alive. Against my better judgment, I started down the stairs. My flashlight flickered as I descended, and the humming grew louder with each step. It wasn't until I reached the bottom that I realized the sound wasn't coming from a machine. It was coming from below the floor, and that's when I saw the door, heavy, steel, and covered in scratches. The door at the bottom of the staircase wasn't like anything I'd seen in the rest of the building. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, and made of reinforced steel. The surface was pockmarked with dents, like someone or something had been pounding on it from the inside. Deep scratches crisscrossed the metal, some so jagged they looked like they had been gouged out by claws. But the strangest thing was the discoloration. It wasn't rust. It was something darker, almost black, spreading out from the edges of the door like veins. I hesitated. Everything in my gut was screaming at me to turn around and go back upstairs, but curiosity had its claws in me. I reached out and touched the surface of the door. It was ice cold, colder than the rest of the building, and as my fingers brushed it, I swear I felt a vibration, faint but steady, like the door was alive. The handle was one of those heavy industrial ones, and as I gripped it, I realized it wasn't locked. It shouldn't have surprised me. If whatever was inside needed this kind of door to contain it, locks probably wouldn't matter. With a deep breath, I yanked the handle. The door groaned open, the sound echoing through the stairwell. It wasn't the kind of creak you hear from old hinges. It was deeper, almost organic, like a whale call reverberating through metal. Behind the door was a room unlike anything I'd seen so far. The walls were reinforced with thick steel plates, and every inch of them was covered in more scratches. These weren't random. They looked deliberate, like they formed some kind of language or code. Spiral patterns twisted across the walls, overlapping in a way that made my eyes water. The floor was concrete, stained with something dark and sticky. At first, I thought it was old motor oil, but the smell told me otherwise. It was the same metallic, rotten scent I'd noticed upstairs, only stronger, much stronger. I had to pull my scarf up over my nose just to keep from gagging. In the center of the room was a circular hole in the floor, about 6 feet wide. A heavy metal grate covered it, bolted down with industrial screws the size of my fist. The grate looked old, older than the rest of the room, like it had been salvaged from something else. And the claw marks, they were deepest around the edges of the hole, as if whatever had been here before had been trying to get out. I moved closer, careful not to step in the stains. The air around the hole felt wrong, like it was heavier, thicker. My flashlight beam wavered as I aimed it at the grate, the light dimming just slightly as it passed over the metal. It was like the hole was sucking in everything around it. Light, sound, even warmth. That's when I heard the scratching. It was faint at first, like nails scraping against metal. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The sound was coming from beneath the grate. I leaned in closer, aiming my flashlight directly into the hole. The beam barely penetrated the darkness. It was like the hole swallowed the light whole, leaving nothing but inky blackness. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear something else now. A low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated in my chest. That was enough for me. I snapped a photo of the grate and took a step back. The air in the room felt thicker now, pressing against my skin, like I was underwater. My ears were ringing, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I turned toward the door, ready to get the hell out of there, but something stopped me. The growling had changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was rhythmic, almost like words. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt the sound more than I heard it. It was like it was crawling under my skin, vibrating in my bones. The spirals on the walls seemed to shift in the corner of my vision, the patterns twisting and turning as if they were alive. My camera started to glitch, the screen flickering and freezing, and then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty, but the breath had been real. I could still feel the cold, damp sensation on my skin. The scratching from the grate stopped. Silence filled the room, heavier than before. I stared at the hole, half expecting something to lunge out at me, but nothing happened. I took another step back, keeping my flashlight trained on the hole, when I felt the ground beneath me tremble. It wasn't an earthquake. It was subtle, rhythmic, like footsteps, something massive, moving deep below the ground. I don't remember running out of the room. 1 second, I was standing there, staring at the grate, and the next, I was halfway up the staircase, my heart hammering in my chest. The humming sound I'd heard earlier was louder now, following me as I scrambled back to the main floor. When I finally burst outside into the freezing air, I collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my camera. I glanced back at the building, half expecting to see something staring at me from one of the blacked-out windows. But there was nothing. For a long time, I just sat there, trying to convince myself I hadn't just made the biggest mistake of my life. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that room, whatever was under that grate, it wasn't meant to be found, and I wasn't sure if I'd left it behind. After catching my breath outside, I realized I needed to leave. Now this wasn't just another abandoned military base. This wasn't some quirky urban exploration spot to post for Instagram. This place was wrong, the kind of wrong that burrows into your gut and doesn't let go. I stood up, brushing snow off my pants, and tried to shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air felt different now, heavier, colder. It wasn't just the Arctic chill. It was something else, something alive. Every instinct screamed at me to stop standing around and move. I grabbed my camera, checked my backpack, and started heading back to my car. The snow around the base was deep and untouched, just like before. But as I trudged through it, I noticed something odd. My own footprints from when I'd arrived were still there, but now they weren't alone. About 20 feet from the building, a second set of tracks appeared in the snow. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and spaced farther apart, too far apart to be human. Whatever made them had been heavy enough to compress the snow completely flat, and the tracks didn't follow a straight line. They zigzagged, looping back toward the building and disappearing near the side. I tried to convince myself they were old. Maybe a bear had wandered through here sometime before I arrived. But the tracks weren't weathered or filled with fresh snow. They were crisp, recent. I reached my car, fumbling with my keys as the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. When I finally managed to unlock the door and climb inside, I slammed it shut, locking it immediately. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm my breathing. The vehicle was freezing, and I realized I hadn't left the engine running long enough for the battery-powered heater to do much. That's when I saw it, in the rearview mirror. At first, it looked like a shadow, a vague, dark shape standing in the snow about 50 feet behind the car. My heart nearly stopped. I turned around to look, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of white snow and gray trees. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. "Calm down," I whispered to myself. "You're just freaking yourself out." But the moment I started the engine, something slammed into the back of the car. Hard. The entire vehicle jolted forward, and I let out a yell, instinctively hitting the gas. The tires spun on the icy ground, struggling for traction, but I managed to get the car moving. As I sped away, I glanced in the mirror again, and this time I saw the tracks. They were massive, wide impressions in the snow, following the car. And they weren't footprints anymore. They were drag marks, like something had been crawling after me, clawing at the ground. I didn't stop driving for hours. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something barreling down the snowy trail behind me. The tracks disappeared after a while, but the tension didn't leave my chest. My heart was still racing by the time I reached the nearest town, a small, run-down place with maybe 5 buildings and a population that couldn't have been more than a few dozen people. I pulled into the parking lot of the only gas station, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I climbed out of the car, glancing around nervously. The station's lights buzzed weakly overhead, barely illuminating the empty lot. Inside, the cashier, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a face like he hadn't slept in days, watched me with a bored expression as I walked up to the counter. "Fill her up?" he asked, his voice slow and disinterested. I nodded, but then I hesitated. "Hey, do you know anything about that old military base out near the woods? The one north of here?" His face changed instantly. The boredom disappeared, replaced by something darker. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. "You went out there?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I admitted, feeling a pang of regret. "I'm a photographer. I heard it was abandoned, so I thought I'd check it out." "You shouldn't have done that." His tone sent a chill down my spine. He glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening, before lowering his voice even more. "That place is off limits for a reason," he said. "It's been closed for decades. No one goes there anymore. Not anyone from around here anyway." "Why?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my palms were sweating. "What happened there?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed a cigarette from a pack on the counter and lit it, taking a long drag before speaking. "Rumor is, back in the 80s, they were running experiments out there. Biological stuff. Things they didn't want the public knowing about. One day, something went wrong. They shut the place down overnight, told everyone to stay away. People around here heard strange noises coming from the base for years after. Some still do. He paused, taking another drag. Whatever they were messing with, it wasn't natural. I wanted to press him for more details, but the look in his eyes told me not to push it. I paid for the gas and left, my mind racing with what he'd said. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place with peeling wallpaper, flickering lights, and a faint smell of mildew. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it for good measure, then sat down to review the photos I'd taken at the base. Most of them were just what I expected. Shots of decaying buildings, empty hallways, and scratched up walls. But when I got to the ones I'd taken in the sealed room, my stomach dropped. There was something in the corner of one of the photos. It wasn't clear, more of a shadow than anything, but it had a shape, tall, hunched, with what looked like long, spindly limbs. I flipped to the next photo, and the shape was closer. Not by much, but enough to make my hands start shaking. The third photo was the worst. The shape was gone, but the grate in the center of the room was bent. One of the bolts had been pulled free, the metal warped like it had been pried open. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But as I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, I heard something else. A low rhythmic scratching coming from the wall behind me. Something had followed me. The scratching behind the motel wall wasn't steady. It came in bursts, faint at first, like nails dragging across wood, then stronger, like claws raking against drywall. My chest tightened, and I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But where could I go? The room was a box, and whatever was out there, whatever had followed me, was between me and the only exit. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to make sense of the sound. It didn't have a rhythm or a clear pattern, but every scrape felt deliberate, calculated. I grabbed the chair from the door and shoved it against the wall, as if that could somehow protect me. My camera was still on the table, and for a split second, I considered snapping a photo, but some instinct deep in my gut told me not to. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My ears strained, searching for anything, footsteps, breathing, anything at all. But there was nothing, just the low whistle of the wind outside and the faint hum of the motel's flickering lights. And then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate bangs on the motel door. I turned to face it, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't the kind of knock you get from a person. It was too heavy, too loud, like something was using its whole body to hit the door. My throat went dry as I stared at the knob, expecting it to turn at any second. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. The knocking came again, harder this time. The entire door shuddered in its frame, and a thin crack splintered down the wood near the lock. "Who's there?" I finally choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Another bang, louder than before. The crack in the door widened, and I stumbled back, grabbing my camera out of pure instinct. The chair I'd shoved under the knob tipped over with a crash as the door shook violently. Whatever was out there didn't just want in, it was trying to tear its way through. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the camera like it was some kind of shield. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the room in an eerie, suffocating silence. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. And then, through the door, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't human. It sounded warped, distorted, like someone trying to talk underwater. The words were garbled, but I could make out one thing clearly. My name. It said my name. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out or gone into some kind of shock, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Pearl sunlight filtered through the thin motel curtains, and the room was empty. The door was still intact. No cracks, no splinters, no sign that anything had tried to get in. For a moment, I thought I dreamed the whole thing. But then I noticed the camera on the table. It was still on, and the battery was almost dead. That didn't make sense. I turned it off after reviewing the photos last night. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the shots. Most of them were the same. The base, the hallways, the sealed room. But near the end, there were new ones. Photos I didn't remember taking. The first showed the motel parking lot, taken from outside. My car was in the shot, and so was my room's window. The second was closer, just the window this time. The third was taken inside the room. It showed me, asleep on the bed, the chair still wedged against the door. I dropped the camera, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and nausea. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Had someone broken in? Had I been so out of it that I didn't notice? But then I remembered the voice, the scratching, the knocking, and I realized something even worse. The photos weren't taken from the door. They were taken from the wall. I didn't stick around to ask questions. I threw my stuff into my bag, left the room key on the counter, and bolted. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached Anchorage. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow felt like it was moving. Every car behind me felt like it was following. I booked an emergency flight home that night, leaving my rental car at the airport without even bothering to fill up the tank. I didn't care about the cost, or the paperwork, or the looks the airline staff gave me as I rushed through security, sweaty and pale and on the verge of a breakdown. I just needed to get as far away from Alaska as possible. It's been 3 days since I got back. I haven't told anyone what happened. Not my friends. Not my family. I keep thinking about the photos, about the claw marks on the walls, about the sound of my name coming through the door. I deleted most of the pictures from my camera, but I couldn't bring myself to delete the ones from the motel. It's not that I want to keep them, but I feel like I have to. Like they're evidence, proof that I'm not crazy. But here's the thing. Last night, while I was reviewing the photos one last time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the last shot, the one taken inside the room, there's a shadow in the corner. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. And it's not just a shadow. It has eyes. I've tried to convince myself it's over, that whatever followed me is still in Alaska, locked away in that godforsaken base. But deep down, I know that's not true. I know, because last night, I heard it again. The scratching. But this time, it wasn't outside the motel or behind the wall. It was inside my closet. I'm a scientist working near Mount St. Helens. The dark web says an alien craft was buried here after the eruption. Last night, we found it. Okay, so I never thought I'd be that guy posting some creepy story on Reddit. But here I am. I don't even know how to start this without sounding insane. You know how they say the truth is stranger than fiction? Yeah, buckle up, because this is going to get weird. I'm a geologist working at a research facility near Mount St. Helens. You've probably heard of it. Big volcano, exploded in 1980. Lots of ash, killed a bunch of trees, that kind of thing. Most people know the basics from history class, but what they don't tell you is that Mount St. Helens has been the center of some really bizarre conspiracy theories. Stuff like underground government facilities, secret mining operations, and, you guessed it, aliens. Normally, I'd laugh this stuff off. I mean, I'm a scientist. We deal in data, not UFO folklore. But about 6 months ago, I got hired for this job, part of a team studying unusual seismic activity around the mountain. Nothing too crazy, right? Just monitoring tremors and mapping lava tubes. At least, that's what they told us we'd be doing. The first red flag? Our contracts. They were weirdly specific about keeping our work classified. No social media, no discussing the project with family or friends, and no personal electronics allowed on site. It was all very hush-hush, even for a government-funded operation, but the pay was good, and honestly, I needed the work, so I signed the dotted line and didn't think too much about it. It wasn't until I overheard some of the field techs talking that I realized this job wasn't exactly what it seemed. They were young, fresh out of college, and apparently thought I was out of earshot. One of them mentioned a post on some dark web forum, something about an alien craft being buried under the mountain after the 1980 eruption. According to the rumor, the government found it while they were cleaning up the blast zone, but instead of digging it out, they decided to bury it deeper. The guy was laughing, saying it was all ridiculous, but something about the way the others got quiet stuck with me. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, okay? I believe in Occam's razor. Whatever the simplest explanation is, it's usually the right one. But over the next few weeks, some things didn't add up. For starters, we weren't just mapping lava tubes. We were drilling. Deep. And not in random spots, either. The drill sites were in very specific, predetermined locations, and nobody on the team seemed to know why. The higher-ups were cagey whenever we asked questions, and any data we collected was uploaded directly to a secure server. No backups, no hard copies. It was like they didn't want us to see the big picture. Then there were the visitors. Once a week, these guys in black SUVs would roll up to the facility. They weren't scientists, more like military contractors, all wearing the same blank expressions and no-nonsense uniforms. They never talked to us, just went straight to the project lead's office. After they left, the lead would always seem stressed, like he'd just gotten bad news. The second red flag came about 2 months into the project. We were working late, running some seismic scans, when one of the techs noticed an anomaly on the readings. It wasn't a lava tube or an earthquake. It was something solid, dense, and huge. It didn't match any geological formations in the area, at least not anything natural. When we brought it to the project lead, his face went pale. He told us to shut it down immediately and not to mention it in our logs. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was directly beneath one of our drill sites. That's when I started digging, not literally, but online. I wanted to know what we were dealing with, so I started looking up old reports from the eruption, news articles, survivor accounts, anything I could find. And let me tell you, some of the stories were wild. People reported seeing strange lights in the sky before the eruption. Others swore they heard metallic sounds coming from deep underground, like machinery or engines. At the time, everyone chalked it up to hysteria, but now, I wasn't so sure. Then I found it. A thread on an obscure forum, buried under layers of broken links and dead-end URLs. The title: Mount St. Helens. The government is hiding something. It was full of cryptic posts, photos of old documents, blurry satellite images, and, weirdly, a bunch of coordinates. One of them matched the exact location of our latest drill site. The most chilling part? One of the posts claimed that whatever was buried under Mount St. Helens wasn't just alien, it was alive. I told myself it was just nonsense, internet garbage. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to that seismic anomaly. What the hell could be so dense and massive that it registered like that? And why was our boss so desperate to keep it quiet? I was still thinking about it the next morning when the lead called an emergency meeting. He told us there'd been a complication with one of the drill sites and that we were shutting down operations temporarily. No explanation, no timeline for when we'd start back up. Just a curt, "Go home and don't talk about this to anyone." That was 3 days ago. Last night, I got a call from one of the field techs. Let's call him Mike. He sounded freaked out, like really freaked out. He wouldn't say much over the phone, just that I needed to meet him at this diner off the highway. When I got there, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He slid a flash drive across the table and told me to be careful. Then he left. I haven't opened it yet. I don't know if I even want to. But whatever's on that drive, I think it might explain what's really going on beneath Mount St. Helens. And I have a feeling I'm not going to like the answer. So, I got home last night, and I just sat there staring at the flash drive like it was a live grenade. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe it would confirm all the weird suspicions I'd been having. Or maybe it would just be a bunch of boring geological data. Either way, I felt like opening it would cross some invisible line, like there was no going back after that. Finally, I grabbed my laptop. Not my work one. God knows that thing's probably monitored, but an old clunker I hadn't used in years. I didn't want to risk plugging the drive into anything traceable, so I booted it up, disconnected the Wi-Fi, and stuck the flash drive in. There were only 3 files on it: a folder labeled Tremors, a video file, and a text document. I opened the folder first. Inside were a bunch of seismic charts. Most of them looked normal, but a few had these weird, jagged spikes. The dates on those spikes, they lined up almost perfectly with the days we'd been drilling. Then I noticed something else. Each of the spikes was accompanied by a smaller anomaly, like an echo or a shadow. It wasn't much, just enough to be noticeable if you looked close. But here's the thing, that shouldn't happen. Seismic waves don't echo like that unless they're bouncing off something unnatural. I moved on to the text file. It was written like a journal entry, and I'm guessing it was from Mike. The tone was frantic, almost like he'd written it in one go without stopping to think. He talked about how he'd been sneaking copies of the seismic data onto his own USB drive. Apparently, the higher-ups had been deleting certain readings from the official logs, anything that didn't fit their narrative. And then there was this line: "It's not just under the mountain, it's moving." I swear my stomach dropped when I read that. Moving? What the hell does that even mean? I thought back to the seismic scans, to the way those echoes seemed to shift slightly with each spike. I hadn't noticed it at the time, but now that I was looking for it, it made sense. Whatever we'd found under Mount St. Helens wasn't just sitting there. It was alive, or at least active. Finally, I opened the video file. It looked like it had been recorded on a phone, probably in one of the mobile labs we'd set up near the drill sites. The camera was shaky, like Mike had been holding it in a hurry. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual, just a table covered in equipment, the kind of stuff we use to monitor vibrations and pressure changes. Then the screen shifted to a monitor, displaying a live seismic feed. I recognized the interface immediately. It was the same program we used in the field. The spikes were back, huge, erratic, and way more intense than anything I'd seen before. But that wasn't what made my skin crawl. It was the sound. You know how earthquakes have that low, rumbling growl? This was different. It was sharper, more deliberate. It sounded like metal grinding against metal, but layered with something deeper, something that almost felt organic. I couldn't explain it, but hearing that sound made my instincts scream to run, to get as far away as possible. Then the video cut to static. It only lasted a few seconds, but when the picture came back, everything was different. The room was empty now, like everyone had just up and left. The camera turned toward the door, and I swear I could hear faint whispers. Not human whispers, though. More like static that almost formed words. Mike's voice came through, low and shaky. "I don't think we're supposed to be here," he said. The screen went black. I sat there for a long time after the video ended. My first thought was to call Mike, to demand answers, but I already knew he wouldn't pick up. He'd practically sprinted out of the diner after handing me the drive, and now I understood why. Whatever we'd found under the mountain, it wasn't just a geological anomaly, and it sure as hell wasn't friendly. The next day, I went back to the lab. I know that sounds stupid, but I couldn't just sit around and do nothing. I needed to see the drill site for myself, to figure out what was going on. When I got there, the place was deserted. No guards, no vehicles, not even a single piece of equipment left behind. It was like the entire operation had been scrubbed overnight. The weirdest part? The drill site was still open. Normally, they'd seal it off if there was any kind of shutdown, but this time they left the entrance completely exposed. I should have turned around right there, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from my car and climbed down into the hole. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, and the deeper I went, the more unnatural it felt. It wasn't just the heat. There was this faint hum, like the walls themselves were vibrating. I kept going until I reached the bottom, where the drill had hit something solid. The rock around it was scorched black, like it had been burned. And then I saw it, a crack in the rock. Not a natural crack, though. This was clean, precise, like it had been cut. I leaned closer, shining my flashlight into the gap, and my breath caught in my throat. There was something inside. At first, I thought it was metal, smooth, dark, and cold to the touch. But as I ran my fingers along the edge, I realized it wasn't metal at all. It felt more like ceramic, or maybe something I couldn't even identify. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't part of the natural landscape. I don't know how long I stayed down there, long enough for my flashlight to start dimming. That's when I heard it, the same grinding noise from the video, but louder this time. It was coming from the crack, from whatever was inside, and then it moved. I don't mean it shifted slightly or made another sound. I mean the entire wall seemed to ripple, like a living thing waking up. My heart was pounding as I stumbled back, scrambling for the ladder. I swear I heard something whisper my name, but I didn't stick around to find out. When I got back to the surface, the sun was setting. I climbed into my car, hands shaking, and sped back to town. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting one of those black SUVs to appear out of nowhere. As I write this, I can still feel that hum, like it's stuck in my bones. Whatever's under Mount St. Helens, it's not just a buried artifact. It's alive. And I think we woke it up. I couldn't sleep last night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crack in the rock, felt the strange material under my fingers. And worse, I kept hearing that sound. It wasn't just the grinding, it was the whispers. They weren't words exactly, more like fragmented syllables that almost made sense. It was my name. I'm not imagining this. I know what I heard. I tried convincing myself it was just my brain playing tricks on me, maybe an echo of my own fear, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something had been aware of me down there. I decided to lay low for a while. The lab was clearly off limits now, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself by asking questions. But here's the thing about knowing there's a secret. It doesn't let you rest. I couldn't stop thinking about the flash drive, the seismic anomalies, the strange material in that crack. And then there was Mike. I hadn't heard from him since he gave me the drive. No texts, no calls, nothing. I even swung by his apartment, but it was completely cleaned out. Not like he'd packed up and left, more like someone else had done it for him. No furniture, no personal belongings, not even a single scrap of paper. The place was wiped bare. That's when I knew this wasn't just some rogue experiment gone wrong. Someone was actively covering it up, and they weren't playing around. The next day, I started noticing things. Small at first. A black SUV parked down the street from my house. A man in a suit lingering a little too long outside the grocery store when I ran errands. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I saw the same SUV at 3 different locations in one day. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted me to know they were watching. That night, I tried to call one of my old coworkers, a guy named Alan, who'd been on the seismic team with me. His phone went straight to voicemail, so I sent him a text. Nothing. The next day, I checked his social media accounts. Everything was gone. Deleted. Like he never existed. I wasn't just being followed. They were erasing us. I started keeping a journal, just in case something happened to me. I wrote down everything I remembered about the project, every detail about the seismic anomalies, every strange incident. I even included sketches of what I'd seen in the drill site. I wasn't sure who I was writing it for. Maybe my family, maybe the authorities, or maybe just the next poor soul who stumbled across this nightmare. On the 3rd night, I woke up to a strange sound outside my window. It was faint, like static, but with a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. I stayed completely still, heart pounding, straining to listen. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying not to be noticed. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial 911, the sound stopped. No footsteps, no static, just silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in my house any longer. It didn't feel safe. I packed a bag, grabbed the flash drive and my journal, and headed for a motel on the outskirts of town. The place was a dump, but it was cash only and off the grid, which was exactly what I needed. For the next few days, I tried piecing together everything I knew. I reread Mike's notes, replayed the video, and studied the seismic data until my eyes blurred. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. Every piece of information only raised more questions. Why was the material in the crack so strange? Why was it moving? And most importantly, why did it feel alive? On the 5th night at the motel, I had a dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I was back at the drill site, standing in the dark with nothing but a flashlight. The walls around me were pulsing, almost breathing, and the hum was louder than ever. Then I saw it. A shape, massive and incomprehensible, shifting in the shadows. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things, twisting and folding into each other like a living kaleidoscope. I couldn't focus on it for more than a second without feeling dizzy, like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. And then it spoke, not in words exactly, but in emotions. Fear, hunger, loneliness. The feelings hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming and impossible to escape. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, like I'd been holding my breath for hours. The worst part, the hum from my dream was still there. Faint, but definitely real. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and there was only one place I could think to go. I packed up my stuff and drove back toward the mountain, taking back roads to avoid being followed. By the time I reached the drill site, it was dark. The area was completely abandoned. No guards, no equipment, not even a single tire track. The hole was still there though, and this time it wasn't empty. As I approached, I noticed a faint glow coming from deep inside the shaft. It wasn't a natural light, more like the kind you'd see from bioluminescent algae, but brighter and shifting in unnatural patterns. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to climb down. The hum grew louder with every step. By the time I reached the bottom, it was almost unbearable, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I shone my flashlight toward the crack, and my stomach turned. The gap was wider now, like something had forced it open. And on the other side, movement. Slow, deliberate, almost curious. Before I could react, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then I heard it again, the whispers. This time, they weren't just saying my name. Help us. It wasn't a voice. It was thousands of voices, all layered on top of each other, each one desperate and pleading. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering, and for a split second, I saw something reaching through the crack. Not a hand, not a claw, but something in between. I don't remember how I got out of there. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, speeding down the highway with my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The hum was still in my ears, and I could swear the static whispers were coming from my radio, even though it was off. I didn't go home after leaving the drill site. I didn't go back to the motel either. Somehow, I knew neither place would be safe anymore. It felt like whatever I'd encountered in the depths of the mountain wasn't confined to that crack. It was spreading. I could feel it, like static electricity clinging to my skin. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to piece together my next move. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, bouncing between fear, curiosity, and a gnawing sense of guilt. I wasn't supposed to find this thing, let alone interact with it. But now that I had, it was like a door had opened, and something was walking through. Around dawn, I pulled into a 24-hour diner on the edge of a small town. The place was empty, except for a tired waitress and a guy in the corner nursing a cup of coffee. I ordered black coffee and toast, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to sit and think without drawing attention to myself. That's when I noticed my phone buzzing in my pocket. I froze. I hadn't touched it in days. terrified that turning it on would give away my location. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. No caller ID. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello?" There was no voice on the other end, just static. At first, I thought it was a bad connection, but then I heard something faint beneath the noise, like whispers, just on the edge of perception. My hand tightened around the phone as I listened. "You saw us." The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried an edge of something that made my blood run cold. Before I could respond, the call disconnected. I stared at the phone, my hand trembling. What the hell was happening to me? I threw some cash on the table and left the diner, my appetite completely gone. I had no idea where to go, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't run from this. Whatever had reached out to me, it wasn't going to stop. It wanted something, and for some reason, it had chosen me. I thought about the flash drive again, about Mike and the others who had disappeared. Maybe there was something I'd missed, some clue buried in the data. But going back to the mountain wasn't an option, not yet. I needed a safe place to dig deeper. I drove to a remote campsite I remembered from a hiking trip years ago. It was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest, perfectly isolated. After setting up my tent, I powered up my old laptop and opened the files again. This time, I scrutinized every detail, every chart and note. It was in the seismic data that I found something new. A pattern. The anomalies, the spikes and echoes, they weren't random. They formed a sequence, repeating over and over like a code. It wasn't immediately obvious, but when I lined them up and cross-referenced the timestamps, it became clear. The signals weren't natural. They were intentional. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. I sat back, my head spinning. If the signals were a message, who was it for? Us? Or something else? The thought of it being something else made my skin crawl. What if the crack in the rock wasn't just a barrier? What if it was a prison? And what if we were the ones who'd started breaking it apart? As the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something strange. The hum was back, not loud, but just loud enough to be heard over the rustling leaves. I looked around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. Then I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A small orb of pale green light, floating silently through the trees. It moved like it had a purpose, weaving between branches and coming to a stop a few feet in front of me. I didn't know whether to run or stay still. My instincts screamed that this wasn't natural, but my curiosity won out. Slowly, I reached toward it. As my fingers got close, the orb pulsed, and for a split second, I saw something. Flashes of images in my mind. A vast, endless void, shapes too alien to comprehend. And then a single word, clear and undeniable. Home. The orb vanished, leaving me alone in the dark. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Everything about this situation was spiraling out of control. The messages, the whispers, the light, none of it made sense, but it all felt connected. I started going over the data again, desperate for answers. That's when I found something else. Coordinates. They were buried deep in the files, hidden in the seismic readings. At first, I thought they pointed to the drill site, but when I cross-referenced them with a map, they marked a completely different location, a remote spot in the forest, about 10 miles north of Mount St. Helens. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike had left them there for me to find. The next morning, I packed up my gear and headed for the coordinates. The drive was rough, unpaved roads that eventually gave way to overgrown trails. I parked my car a mile out and hiked the rest of the way, the trees closing in around me like a tunnel. When I reached the spot, I wasn't sure what I'd find. Maybe another drill site or some kind of abandoned facility, but what I found was worse. A crater. It wasn't natural, that much was obvious. The edges were too clean, the walls too smooth. It looked like something had been blasted into the earth. At the center of the crater was a dark, metallic object, partially buried in ash and dirt. I approached cautiously, the hum growing louder with every step. The object was massive, easily the size of a house, and its surface was covered in strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them. As I got closer, I noticed something else. Openings. Small circular ports dotted along the surface, each one glowing faintly. And then I saw movement, shadows flickering just beyond the openings, like something was watching me from inside. My hands were shaking as I reached out to touch the surface. It was cold, impossibly cold, like touching the void of space itself. The moment my fingers made contact, the hum stopped, and then the voices started again, not whispers this time, screams, thousands of them, overlapping in a deafening cacophony that made me stagger back. Images flooded my mind. A planet engulfed in flames, a civilization torn apart by war, and something else, a predator lurking in the shadows of the stars. I realized then that the thing in the crater wasn't just a ship, it was a warning. I don't remember running back to my car, but somehow I made it. As I sped away, the hum returned, louder than ever. It felt like it was coming from everywhere now, vibrating through the earth, the trees, even the air itself. And as I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw the light again. Not one this time, but dozens of them, floating through the forest like fireflies. They weren't following me. They were heading for the mountain. I didn't stop driving. Not for food, not for gas. Not even when I realized I didn't have a destination. My mind was racing, replaying everything I'd seen. The crater, the metal, the lights, the screams. Whatever was happening beneath Mount St. Helens wasn't just a geological anomaly. It wasn't a government secret or some rogue experiment gone wrong. It was something else. Something we were never meant to find. By the time I finally pulled over, the sun was setting. I was on an empty stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but dense forest. I stepped out of the car, desperate for air, and that's when I noticed it. The silence. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the world itself is holding its breath. And then I heard it, the hum. Faint at first, but growing louder. It wasn't coming from my surroundings this time. It was inside me, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I stumbled back into the car and slammed the door, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My ears were ringing, the hum resonating deeper with each passing second, and then the whispers started again. Help us. Free us. I drove until I reached the next town, a small, sleepy place with a gas station and a single diner. I parked in the back lot, far from the lights, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. The hum had faded, but the whispers lingered, echoing in my mind like a broken record. Free us. I didn't understand. Free what? The thing in the crater? The shadows I'd seen behind the glowing ports. I thought back to the flashes of images I'd seen when I touched the metal. The destruction, the predator. Was it trying to warn me? Or was it something worse? something manipulating me into setting it loose. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the window. I jumped, my heart pounding, and turned to see a man standing outside the car. He was wearing a tattered jacket, his face obscured by the shadows of the parking lot. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and strained. I cracked the window, my pulse racing. "Who are you?" The man glanced over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone. Or something. "Doesn't matter. You need to leave. Now." I hesitated. "Why? What's going on?" He leaned closer, and in the dim light, I could see his face, pale, gaunt, and marked with strange dark lines that looked like scars or burns. His eyes were bloodshot, but there was something else in them. Something wrong. "They're waking up," he whispered, "and if you stay, they'll take you too." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I sat there, staring after him, every instinct screaming at me to follow. But before I could move, my phone buzzed again. Another call. No caller ID. My hands shook as I answered. "Hello?" This time, there was no static, just a single voice, calm and deliberate. "It's too late." The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every shadow outside the car felt like a threat. I kept seeing those lights, those strange orbs floating through the forest, and I knew they weren't just in my mind. They were real, and they were everywhere now. By morning, I knew I couldn't run anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. Not for me, not for anyone. I had to go back to the mountain. I had to end this. The drive back was like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The closer I got to Mount St. Helens, the more the landscape changed. The trees were dead, their trunks twisted and blackened like they'd been burned from the inside out. The air was heavy, thick with a strange metallic taste that clung to my tongue. And then there were the lights. They were everywhere now, dozens of them floating through the trees like ghostly lanterns. They didn't follow me, but I could feel them watching, their presence pressing against my mind like an unspoken question. When I reached the drill site, I almost didn't recognize it. The hole was wider now, gaping like an open wound in the earth. The hum was deafening, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. And the glow, God, the glow, was blinding, spilling out of the depths like liquid light. I climbed down into the pit, the hum growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the bottom, it felt like my skull was going to split open. The crack in the rock was gone now, replaced by a massive, jagged opening. And on the other side, it was waiting. The ship, if that's what it even was alive now, its surface rippling like liquid metal. The glowing ports were wide open, and the shadows I'd seen before were no longer inside. They were outside now, moving. They weren't shapes, not exactly. They were concepts, things my brain couldn't fully process, like trying to comprehend a fourth dimension. They shifted constantly, forming and reforming, each iteration more alien and impossible than the last. And then they noticed me. The hum stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had ceased to exist. The shapes, or beings, or whatever they were, stilled, their attention locking onto me. "Free us." The words weren't spoken. They were felt, injected directly into my mind. I staggered back, the weight of their intent pressing down on me like gravity. I didn't understand what they wanted, not fully, but I could feel their desperation, their hunger. One of them moved closer, its form shifting as it approached. For a moment, it almost looked human, an echo of a person I might have known. But the closer it got, the more wrong it became, its edges fracturing and bleeding into the air around it. You brought us here. Now you must set us free. I don't know what happened next. One moment, I was standing there, staring into the impossible. The next, I was outside, stumbling through the ash and dirt, my ears ringing and my vision blurred. I don't remember climbing out of the pit. I don't even remember running to my car. But I remember the lights. They were rising now. Dozens, no, hundreds of them, floating into the sky like a swarm of fireflies. And in the distance, I could hear it. The grinding metallic roar of something massive and ancient coming to life.